All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and excited to get going with this next panel. My name is Jess Dempsey. I'm a prof in geography at UBC, and climate has been a theme. We've already seen it throughout the day. It's come up on all the panels so far. So today, in this panel here, we're going to dig into it. Its title is Climate Apartheid. Apartheid involves, of course, amongst other things, a spatial segregation, and this, of course, we all know, places becoming uninhabitable, subject to climate whiplash, and we know that, of course, nowhere on the planet is not going to be subject to these forces. But we also know that, as Alberto said, that perhaps the far right is perhaps preparing itself most clearly for for climate change. Naomi and Astra had a piece in The Guardian about sort of this like national level prepperism that's going on. So I think that there are folks who are trying to kind of make themselves exceptions to climate change. And I was sort of thinking that the horizon, the sort of geographical imaginary, partially because the 6th season is out right now of The Handmaid's Tale, that the geographical imaginary on offer from the far right does feel a lot like the sort of pro-natalist, deeply patriarchal Gilead, who turns itself to sort of cleaning, after the overshoot up for its own particular white populations. So, we're going to start our panel with Jerry Pratt and Rafi Arefin, who have been doing some excellent work around housing and climate justice. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jess. So I'll start with the housing. We will wind our way to climate. We're going to start with a quote from Engels' book, The Housing Question, so bear with me, the quote. What is meant today by housing shortage is the peculiar intensification of the bad housing conditions of the workers as a result of the sudden rush of population to the big towns, a colossal increase in rents, a still further aggravation of overcrowding in the individual houses, and for some, the impossibility of finding a place to live in at all. And this housing shortage gets talked of so much only because it does not limit itself to the working class, but has affected the petty bourgeoisie also. Frederick Engels wrote The Housing Question over 150 years ago to diagnose housing conditions in 19th century European cities. What today is known as the housing crisis, then, is not a crisis of the day, but a deep, enduring problem endemic to our economies, societies, and cities. So we're drawing inspiration today from Engels' text because it places the housing question within the long arc of housing injustice. And much like Engels, who managed to develop a deep structural analysis while giving this minute attention to geographical specificity, we're attempting here to situate the housing question within some of the contemporary dynamics of our time, our place. And in particular, we're going to focus on the housing question in relation to the uneven impacts of climate change and the contentious racial politics of migration. So it's easy enough to say that housing, climate, and migration are connected. We hear it a lot from conservatives. The political right and neoliberal center has been very quick to make the connections. Housing is in short supply, they tell us in part, because of the unchecked flow of immigrants to Canada. So too, we're told that government regulation, standards, and requirements for climate retrofits limit supply by placing undue burdens on already struggling and overregulated developers and investors. These narratives are dangerous because they tell simple, abstracted stories of the crisis that function as dog whistles to dehumanize and blame particular categories of often vulnerable people, a signature tactic, of course, of fascism in managing the crisis it produces in the lives of workers. But there are progressive connections to be made between migration, climate, and the housing crisis in support of those on the front lines, of these intersecting issues. And we're just going to tell one of those much more complex stories through some of the research that we've done in partnership with the grassroots organization RAMA, which stands for Radical Action with Migrants in Agriculture. Migrant agricultural workers are kind of an interesting category of worker to put into conversation with Engels, who insisted that the housing crisis must be understood within an expanded circuit of value extraction in capitalist societies. And we can see this expanded circuit of value extraction with agriculture workers quite clearly because the employers provide the housing and profit from their labor. So we can see very starkly how employers maintain the profitability of their businesses in the face of climate change through a crisis of housing and precarious employment for migrant workers. So the agriculture workers that come to Canada are mainly coming from Mexico and Jamaica. Most are on temporary seasonal work permits. They are, I mean, if you think this is an issue that doesn't affect you, they are really the backbone of Canada's food security. So this is an issue for all of us. Almost a third of agricultural workers in crop production in Canada are temporary migrant workers, a third. Even employer organizations and actually business or government representatives are very explicit that migrants really are essential workers, that the Canadians would not do this work under current wage and work conditions. So the level of exploitation is, nobody's hiding that really. From our research with Rama, where workers, and the research is very simple, we just asked workers to measure temperatures in their housing. From that research, and a small caveat too, we got going rather late in the season, and so we didn't even capture the hottest times of the year. So, but we have 4 findings. We're repeating this year to get the fuller season. So first, workers recorded extremely high temperatures in their housing. The maximum temperature recorded was 42.8 degrees centigrade, and this was in a common area in worker housing. Recorded indoor temperatures exceeded 30 degrees centigrade many days running, and remarkably, indoor housing temperatures were consistently higher than outdoor temperatures. So what that means is that workers endure high temperatures around the clock without relief in the fields and in their homes. These temperatures exceed virtually every guideline that we can find, including some that exist at home in BC. So it exceeds the maximum indoor temperature stipulated by the Western Agricultural Labour Initiative, which is a business organization, WALI. It exceeds the BC Agricultural Council's 2016 guidelines for seasonal housing for temporary foreign workers. It exceeds the World Health Organization's recommendations for temperatures below 32 degrees during the day and 24 degrees centigrade at night. Second, the workers' precarity as temporary workers means that they're loath to ask or demand air conditioning for fear of being seen as a problematic worker. The repercussions of being labeled as a problematic worker can be extreme. They can be repatriated by their employer that season. Their employer could choose not to rehire them the following season, or they could be allocated to a worse farm, either in BC or elsewhere in Canada.
Thanks so much, Jerry. So I'll cover our last 2 findings here and then reflect a little bit on what our findings and our work meant around climate apartheid. So third, federal and provincial guidelines and inspections, which are meant really to ensure that employer-provided housing meets basic standards, are ineffective. The adequacy of the inspection process has been in dispute for a long time. For instance, inspections are often done before workers arrive for the season. The worst employer-provided housing is shielded from inspection, and workers rarely have an opportunity to speak directly with inspectors themselves. Perhaps, though, most striking is the fact that climate change appears to be reshaping what qualifies as safe heat exposure, and guidelines have become more lax as temperatures have risen. So in British Columbia, provincial guidelines from WALI, the Western Agricultural Labour Initiative, it's an employer-run agricultural council, have been replaced for the federal guidelines. Now, what is particularly alarming is that these WALI guidelines have loosened as temperatures have actually risen. So we did some work looking back at historical inspection forms. And in 2016, the BC Agricultural Council's housing inspection form included the following question. So I'm going to quote it directly. Quote, can a temperature ranging from 19 degrees Celsius minimum and 25.5 degrees Celsius maximum be maintained in the accommodations at all times, either by heating or cooling as necessary? So the key numbers there are 19 degrees and 25.5 degrees, and then the temporal requirement at all times. By 2020, this is the new inspection form that's still in use today. By 2020, the pre-season inspection form read slightly differently. Quote, can the interior temperature be maintained at most times, so from all times to most times, between 18 Celsius and 27 Celsius while occupied by temporary foreign workers? In other words, the maximum allowable indoor temperature has been increased, and new language offers considerable wiggle room for enforcement. A tacit acknowledgement really kind of baked into this mundane inspection form that more harm will indeed be done. Fourth and finally, employers are taking measures to mitigate the effects of climate change, but that's on crop production, but they're doing almost nothing to address the potentially life-threatening effects of heat on workers, especially in their employer-provided rental housing. So those are our four findings, right? And some have framed these converging crises of housing, migration, and climate as climate apartheid. Housing conditions and heat in the fields have both been long-standing complaints from migrant workers and points of struggle and organizing for them and their advocates. I mean, in many ways, these are really the mainstay issues of migrant and labor justice organizing in Canada and in the US. So what does thinking through these configurations of housing, heat, labor, and migration through the lens of climate apartheid reveal? That's our question that I'll conclude with. And to do that, I'll tell a bit of a story. So after releasing these results last summer, that we wrote with Rama, we were invited on the CBC Okanagan's morning radio show to discuss some of the findings. Rama asked that we do the interview as they were concerned about public appearances, drawing attention to their advocates in a time of anti-migrant sentiment and anti-migration sentiments in Canadian politics. The interview was relatively straightforward. It was at 7 a.m. It was on kind of morning talk radio, except the sympathetic host asked a question, seemingly to provide space for another party that was absent from our work, and that party was farm owners and operators. The host asked the following question, and I'm going to quote it at some length. So he asked me, quote, "We've heard people who own farms say, look, what's the problem here? It's hot in Mexico. Sometimes there's no air conditioning. You know, they must be used to it. And this is the host, and I'm using air quotes here, like can you just respond to that argument?" So during the interview, I didn't answer this question head on, but I returned to the empirical findings of the report to emphasize the inhumane and unjust conditions that we had documented. Reflecting later on the interview and on that question, Jerry and I used many words to describe the question, including the idea of climate apartheid. This is an apartheid that parallels what might be termed labor apartheid, where migrant bodies are expected to labor under conditions unacceptable to Canadians, or housing injustice, where migrant workers are expected to inhabit inhumane housing conditions. But embedded in the radio show's host's questions is a premise, a very dangerous one, right? That different people should be expected in practice, in regulations, or both, to endure different thresholds of heat. And these different thresholds should be determined by markers of racialization, country of origin, and migration status. So while the host seemed to reject such assumptions, stating for the listeners, I'm using air quotes here, he introduced a dangerously commonsensical and potentially convincing, but of course racist, idea into the conversation. Shouldn't workers of Jamaican and Mexican origin just be able to bear the heat? Now, if climate apartheid is understood as a form of segregation in which the uneven impacts of climate, like heat, are exacerbating old and creating new forms of structural inequalities, then this might be an apt descriptor to explain the relations of housing, migration, and climate, at least here in BC's interior. Unenforced tenancy laws, spotty housing inspections, extreme heat, and the precarity and disenfranchisement baked into Canada's temporary migration programs are really creating the circumstances of climate apartheid, where certain people, based on their migration status, class, and race, are regularly and through state abandonment and neglect, systematically exposed and forced to endure the inhumane bouts of heat, all the while laboring to keep Canada food secure. So to conclude, we want to return to that moment and that question from the radio host. Quote, can you respond to that argument? We wish we'd answered differently. We wish we'd answered as follows. Do we want to live in a province, a country, or a world in which different bodies based on race and migration status are subjected to different thresholds of heat tolerance in their workplaces and in their homes? If your answer is no, which we hope it is, then the question is not what can we do to avoid an emerging climate apartheid, but instead, what do we urgently need to do to get us out of this already existing form of exploitation and oppression? Jerry and I have a little bit of an idea. So in May of this year, next month, we're traveling to Ontario together to work with a group of advocates and academics to produce a national standard for housing for migrant agricultural workers. Now, the question, of course, is, will climate apartheid be defeated by a list of technical standards? The answer should be obvious. The answer is alone, of course, not. And to return to Engel's essay that we opened with, this was one of actually his primary warnings 150 years ago, a disdain for reformist efforts that didn't challenge the root drivers of the housing crisis. Capitalist urbanization, which in our contemporary case is coupled with a powerful Canadian agricultural industry and an extremely repressive system of migration. But what this exercise in technical standards does do is envision a progressive future. It's not just a critique of the present, but a normative, constructive vision for our province and the country. A set of technical standards that are congruent with a world in which migrant agricultural workers are humanized, are protected as tenants, and valued for the work they do. It envisions a world where ethnicity and migration status does not dictate if you'll be injured, maimed, or even killed in the next climate-induced heat wave. Thank you.
Wow, thanks so much, Rafi and Jerry, for bringing some really action-oriented, in the title of this teach-in ideas to the fore, especially around housing, labor, and food production, so really important. So to round things off today, we have an honorary geographer, Marc Fawcett-Atkinson, who is a journalist who's been doing some really important work following far-right climate denialism and with the National Observer, which, if you aren't familiar with, is a really important place for journalism in Canada. Marc, thank you.
Hello. I think you can hear me. I will be a bit less academic than pretty much everyone else. I'm sorry. Hope that's okay. So I expect most of you have heard of Jordan Peterson. I'm assuming. Yeah. So in February, I was standing about 6 feet away from him, crouching, taking photos of him as he was essentially chastising Nigel Farage for being divorced. It was a surreal experience. And this happened because I was in London with 2 colleagues, Jeff Debinky with DSMOG and Sandra Bartlett, also with the National Observer, reporting on what's called the Conference of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, or ARC. The organization was co-founded in 2023 by Peterson and Philippa Stroud, a British lord. She was quite involved in the Brexit movement, the pro-Brexit movement, also a climate denier. And their goal was really to create an intellectual hub for the right, to essentially replace the World Economic Forum, to replace Davos, to kind of supersede these liberal institutions and replace them with a right-wing intellectual group hub. Their central thesis is that what they call Western civilization is in decline, and that's largely because of wokeism. Their code for progressive values, policies, such as climate action, women's bodily autonomy, government regulations against toxics, migration, trans rights, LGBTQ rights, the works. So in other words, I was, in the belly of the beast and having Jordan Peterson scowl at me. Bit surreal. Behind me, the hall we were in, this kind of massive East London conference hall, was filled with about 3,000 people. Pretty much everyone had paid at least 2,500 Canadian, 1,500 pounds, and some had paid more. We weren't quite sure, couldn't quite figure that out. And it was a mix of business people, evangelicals, some Jordan Peterson fans. I met one guy in a cowboy hat with cowboy boots who was just there because he likes Jordan Peterson. Seems expensive to me, whatever. Techno-utopians, elite right-wing politicians. Peter Thiel was quite involved in organizing this. There was a big Heritage Foundation delegation, and Mike Johnson was one of the introductory keynote speakers. There were about 300 Canadians there. Probably the most prominent in terms of speeches and public presence was Candice Bergen, Poilievre's predecessor as the Conservative leader and the leader during the Freedom Convoy. Also there was Leslyn Lewis, who is a current Conservative MP, and actually Poilievre, speaking to Peterson in January on his podcast, hinted that she would likely be a cabinet member. Last year, she's particularly well known for saying that Canada should leave the UN. The dress code was pretty dour. I can guarantee that all of us here today would not fit in with all the suits. To give you a sense of the atmosphere, it was very formal, very businessy, very dull, quite frankly. That said, this group was very energized. It was very evident that they were in their safe environment. They could speak freely. They didn't expect that there was a pesky lefty journalist overhearing their conversations. I hid my name tag for that reason, so no one could Google me. And with a lot of unbridled enthusiasm, they applauded speakers promoting white supremacy, great replacement theory, Trump's drill baby drill theories, and very much so Dodge. There was one slightly more center-right speaker who, attacked Dodge and he got booed off the stage. So, quite scary. Outside the speaking area, so you kind of go in, there was a big lecture hall, and outside there was this exhibit hall with these massive banners on the roof. You would quote keywords like hope, courage, these values that they say they proclaim. And wandering through it was quite surreal because you'd go around and it's just these stalls of conspiracy theorists, and primarily conspiracy theorists, honestly, and climate deniers having these stalls and promoting their message and very much kind of building this network and building this group and this collective of people to essentially impose a right-wing order on the world. That's very much their vision. There were also, and this I found quite interesting, a coterie of young people. I'm assuming students. The sense I got from them was maybe students at Oxford, one of the elite or several of the elite UK universities. They weren't allowed to talk to anyone about who they were, what they were doing there. They were in white coats, so I called them the white coats. And they were, keeping the order, and by day 2, they were also following me. I kind of took the brunt for the other 2 who were a bit more discreet than me. And I also realized that quite quickly there was a shadow conference happening on the 3rd floor. So there were kind of these 2 main rooms, and then high up above, there was a 3rd floor where all the elites of this gathering were coming together. So this is, where all the Nigel Farages and the Petersons and the Leslyn Lewises were meeting. I saw a vice president at Microsoft wandering around. We weren't allowed, media wasn't allowed in these conference rooms, and the schedule wasn't public, so I don't know what they were talking about, but I did a lot of wandering around and hanging out in the bathrooms in that part of the building to try to overhear conversations. Mixed success, but got to do what you can. It was also notable that climate action was targeted with a hatred beyond what I'd previously seen, I think in person anyways, of climate denial. It wasn't a question of saying climate change isn't happening, what are you talking about? There were definitely some people who were doing that, but there was also very much a virulent attack on climate measures. Peterson's probably the prime example. He was calling them, calling net zero genocidal, calling anyone who's raising, climate scientists, anyone who's raising the alarm essentially apocalyptic scaremongers, and very much getting a lot of applause for this. He wasn't alone. Other well-liked speakers included Chris Wright, who's Trump's energy secretary, and essentially lashed out calling climate action sinister and implying that it was some form of authoritarian control. Bjorn Lomborg, who's a Danish political scientist who's now based in California, and essentially his shtick is that we're overblowing climate change and there's other problems in the world and we need to deal with those first. He was kind of the resident lefty of the group. And Scott Tinker, who's an American oil executive quite close to the Trump administration, and kind of taking a similar bent and claiming that climate policies were meant to keep the global south poor, to maintain poverty, and to push back against that, we needed to just drill and extract oil. No mention of wealth inequality or any of that. That was not to be talked about, or at least they didn't talk about it. And yeah, like I said, the attacks went beyond kind of a denial, and they often went beyond reason, too. Like, even the hardcore capitalists, there was a big coterie of free market evangelists there, wouldn't seem to recognize, they could also, if you take a, full-on capitalist approach to renewables or to, a transition, that could also benefit them. That concept was very much attacked throughout many, many speeches over the 3 days. And Canadians were very much leading the charge. Like Bergen, the former Conservative leader, ripped out at Trudeau's energy policies over the last 10 years, saying that Canada was committing a near biblical sin by not sharing our God-given resource with the world. I'm not, which is, on top of the sinful implications of biblical, the value judgment, it's also false. Like last year, we produced the most oil ever in Canada, according to Stats Canada. But as most of you know, who have been looking at the right and at fascism, the facts don't matter, particularly when around climate change or the environment. And what mattered to this group in particular was branding climate action as woke, and branding climate action as an attempt to impose climate authoritarianism. And I get that term from Chris Russell, who's a communications prof at Carleton. And using that argument to attack anything and all efforts to avert the crisis. Obviously, the narrative exceeds ARC. We're seeing it with Trump, we're seeing it with Polyev, we're seeing it with other right-wing leaders around the world. In the States, since the inauguration, it's just been pretty much day after day a new story about how Trump is dismantling climate research, climate efforts, policies to help us adapt. In Canada, I actually just wrote a story a few weeks ago about how Polyev is planning similar Similar things, yeah, and like, today, on Thursday, I was writing a piece about how Trump's proposing to gut NASA and NOAA and eliminate not only our research ability and our ability to kind of know what's happening, but also, weather forecasts, which you'd think that even the hardcore fascists would like to know when it's going to rain, but hey, apparently not. So as I tried to make sense of this, I called a few people, including Naomi, thank you. I also called Tanner Mearleys, a political economist at Ontario Tech University, and Hannah Morris, who's a media scholar at U of T, and both of them are experts in climate and fascism. And really the common message that came out, talking to them and thinking about this, was that this link between climate denial and fascism has been not only brewing for years, but also manufactured for years. And many of you know that the oil and gas industry have had a PR campaign going on since the 50s to push back against research and research into climate and to convince us that it's not happening. But they've also worked to link climate research into progressive politics and kind of to generate this narrative that trying to save the planet somehow is woke, and save ourselves is somehow woke. And as Naomi pointed out, it's very much an essential part of the modern fascist project. They want to build an ark, and they were quite explicit about wanting to build an ark to save themselves and let the rest of us burn, drown, freeze, starve. Climate apartheid, essentially. And I think their vision of the world that they want is to create this series of nation states that are very culturally homogenous, idealized, very much white, and based on what they call, or their interpretation rather, of Western values. And really, you don't need to confront history, you don't need to confront difference, you don't need to confront the world as it burns. Of course, no one mentioned what would happen to everyone else who doesn't want to buy into that, or who can't, or even to the ARC disciples now who one day may no longer be able to afford a $2,500 ticket to the conference, or who knows how expensive it could get in the future. That was very much not talked about, as history also wasn't talked about in kind of a historical contextualization of a lot of the overarching problems that they identified. And as I said before, no mention of wealth inequality and essentially power dynamics tied to money. Who's making money, who's benefiting from it, and how that is shaping our ability to connect to others or not. There were a few rays of hope, though, shockingly. To my surprise, I wasn't expecting people to be open to talking to me, and they actually were. Like, these are all like free speech evangelists. So to some degree, if you kind of like poke them gently, they're like, okay, I'll actually like debate with you, which, me looking like I do probably helped things. But I was surprised, and it did give me a certain ray of hope, because a lot of the stories I was hearing of the people who were attending, and these aren't the speakers, these are just, the general people in the audience, is that they were pushed. They had some moment, either in high school, often, or undergrad, where they kind of, felt excluded and then were pushed rightward and kind of fell into this ecosystem and this world and this community. And often when presented with a critique that focused on inequality, for this group anyways, I found that they would start to come around a little bit. Not everyone, and obviously I don't condone them at all. But it was, there was an interesting opening there that I'm not quite sure what that means from kind of, movement building and thinking about how the left wants to approach getting more people on board, essentially. And then there was also a tension that was hard to miss between the business people and, the people there to make money and the people there who are for ideological reasons. And that, obviously, there is one interpretation where you have the wealth gets accumulated in these fortress nation states, but I think there would be an opening there potentially. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it was definitely noticeable. And then third, to conclude, just as I was heading, as I was leaving this conference in this massive conference hall, probably 2 or 3 stories high, these vaulted ceilings. And everyone was flowing out with me. So there were 3,000 people in suits and cocktail dresses walking out, most of them stern and frowning. And the venue was already shifting over. Yeah, the venue was already shifting over to the European Pokemon Championships. So there were like all these teens with dyed hair coming in. It was awesome. It was like a little bit of fun to everything. So, yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Jess. Thank you to the whole panel. We learned so much. We don't have a Q&A after this session,